The sun rose slowly over a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio, painting the pavement in gold, but for William Carter, 63, it was just another day of waiting. Worn boots on cold concrete, a plastic lawn chair, a thermos that hadn't held coffee in weeks. He sat where he always did, outside the Department of Veterans Affairs clinic, beneath a fading banner that read, "Serving those who served." William had served in the Gulf War, 2 deployments, infantry, medals tucked somewhere in a shoebox he hadn't opened in years. He didn't talk about what he saw there. What he did talk about, when anyone bothered to ask, was the time he came home, the promises that were made, the phone calls that went unanswered, the appointments rescheduled, then canceled, then forgotten altogether. For 9 years he waited, for health care, for housing assistance, for dignity. Most days he wrote in a journal on his lap, pages filled with sharp, tidy letters. He wasn't bitter, at least not in the way some expected. He was tired, not just in his body, but in the deep, invisible places that war and bureaucracy carve open. Strangers passed him every morning. Some looked away. Some offered change. A few even snapped photos, mistaking him for a performance artist. No one asked why a man in military greens sat outside a VA clinic with a cardboard sign that read, "I'm still in the waiting room." But then something shifted. It was a rainy Tuesday in March when a teenager, soaked from head to toe, stumbled past the clinic. William noticed his sneakers first, duct-taped and split. The boy paused by the corner of the building, shivering, trying to dry off beneath a flickering streetlight. William stood up. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last $5 he had. No hesitation, no speech, just a soft, weathered hand extending forward. The boy looked up, startled. "I've had meals I didn't earn," William said. "Maybe it's time to pass one along." He smiled gently and returned to his seat, didn't ask for thanks, didn't expect anything in return. The moment would have passed unnoticed, like all the others. Except someone saw it. From across the street, a young woman in a blue Honda had her phone out, filming what she thought would be just another story about American neglect. Instead, she caught something else, a gesture so small it could have slipped through time, if not for the right set of eyes. She posted it that night. 6 hours later, the video had 2 million views. By sunrise, it was 10. What does it say about a society when the forgotten have to give in order to be seen? And what kind of strength does it take to stay kind when the world has turned its back? By mid-morning, the video had begun its quiet crawl across the internet, starting with a few retweets, then local Facebook shares, and within 6 hours, the tidal wave began. Reddit threads dissected every frame. TikTok stitched it with stories of other veterans. Twitter raged and wept in equal measure. The caption beneath the viral clip was simple. This man gave his last $5, not because he had more, but because he saw someone else who had even less. It wasn't just the act. It was the look on his face, tired, but not bitter. It was the way he offered the bill, not dramatically, not performatively, just human. People wanted to know his name. Who was he? Where was he? How had he fallen through the cracks of a system that promised care? By sunrise, the video had 10 million views. By the end of the day, it had passed 32. Journalists from CNN, ABC, and even international press began calling the clinic. Local news vans lined the block, setting up tripods. But William sat exactly where he always had, as if none of it touched him. When asked for comment by a young reporter, he just said, "I didn't give him money to be seen. I gave it so he could feel seen." That quote alone fueled another storm. Comment sections exploded. Why does kindness have to go viral to be noticed? He shouldn't have to suffer to be heroic. Where is the VA? The VA declined interviews. The regional director was reviewing internal protocol, but screenshots of William's missed appointments, outdated intake records, and blank progress notes leaked online within days. Anger turned to action. A young mother from Nebraska launched a GoFundMe with a photo of William's cardboard sign. She titled it, "Help the Man Who Helped First." Within 48 hours, it passed $100,000. By the end of the week, $220,000. But while the money poured in, so did something else: letters. Hundreds of handwritten notes arrived at the clinic's mailroom, more than it had received in a year. Notes from Vietnam vets, from families who'd lost loved ones to suicide, from middle schoolers who'd never met a veteran but were moved to draw him thank you cards. Some envelopes simply said, "To the man on the chair." Clinic staff were overwhelmed. Some secretly handed the letters to William directly, bypassing admin channels. Others quietly apologized in whispers or long looks, unable to say the words. One letter stood out. It was scribbled in pencil, slightly smudged. No return address. It read, "My dad died waiting. I hope you don't. Thank you for sitting there until someone noticed." William folded it and placed it in his front pocket. He would carry it every day after. He was finally invited inside, not by security, not by a form, but by the clinic director himself, suit pressed, handshake, camera ready. A photographer stood just behind him, but William's eyes weren't on the lens. They lingered on the sidewalk he'd sat on for nearly a decade, on the damp outline where his chair used to be, on the place where silence became a stage. He accepted the appointment, took the physicals, spoke with doctors. They used words like baseline deterioration and treatment plan. They scribbled notes, asked about pain levels, nutrition, memory, and William answered, not out of gratitude, not out of spite, simply because he was finally being heard. But the real change came after. When asked if he would keep coming back to the clinic now that things were moving, he nodded, then paused. "I'll go in," he said, "but not for me." Reporters looked puzzled. He didn't explain. What if being seen isn't the end of the journey, but just the beginning of responsibility? And what if the most powerful protest is refusing to disappear? The next time William returned to the VA clinic, he didn't bring a chair. He didn't bring a sign. He brought a clipboard, a notepad, and a question for every veteran still sitting outside. What do you need that no one's giving? Answers varied: warm socks, a phone charger, a ride to a job interview, someone to help fill out online forms, a place to sit without being asked to move. So William started making lists. He rented a small, forgotten storefront just 3 blocks from the clinic, one that used to be a laundromat. The landlord, a Korean War vet himself, gave him the keys for a fraction of the price. Inside, it was dusty, broken tiles, old paint peeling from walls. But William saw what no one else could. Not a building, but a response. He used part of the GoFundMe money, not for himself, but to buy chairs, blankets, a second-hand coffee maker, and Wi-Fi routers. Volunteers showed up unasked. One woman donated books. Another brought canned soup. A barber offered free haircuts on Thursdays. Within 2 weeks, the space had a name, spray-painted across the inside window: the waiting room. But this time, it wasn't a place to wait for a system to respond. It was a place to respond when the system didn't. Veterans began dropping by, not just for aid, but for company. Some came to sit in silence. Others shared stories they hadn't told in decades. There was no intake form, no insurance ID check, just a warm seat, a hot drink, and a pair of eyes that said, "I see you." William wasn't trying to be a hero. He mopped the floors every morning, took out the trash, cleaned out the coffee pot when it burned too long. He showed up early, left late. He never used the word center. He called it a hallway between isolation and hope. One afternoon, a teenage boy walked in, the same boy from the rain. He had seen the mural someone was painting on the alley wall, William seated with the cardboard sign behind him, and the boy receiving that $5 bill. Now dry, older, more alert, the boy had come to say thank you. He didn't say much, just handed William a sandwich and said, "I'm working now, at a deli. First paycheck's Friday." William smiled and handed him a broom. "Help me sweep. That's all I ask." The moment was quiet, powerful, unnoticed by cameras, but real in the way that most headlines never are. The waiting room kept growing. Veterans from across the state stopped by. Some brought donations, some came just to shake his hand. He put up a whiteboard above the coffee station. Each morning, he'd write something new, quotes, jokes, names of those who came and didn't return. One morning, it read, "We're not broken. We're just buried under too much silence." He never let the cameras turn the place into a circus. When news outlets tried to do interviews inside, he declined. "If they want a story," he said, "let them sit and listen like everyone else." Despite the viral fame, William never opened a bank account for the space. Every dollar spent was posted on a bulletin board, handwritten, simple. The money wasn't what kept it alive. It was something else. A woman whose husband had died waiting for medication now ran the pantry. A former Army nurse led trauma writing workshops on Saturdays. A 9-year-old boy who lost his uncle in Afghanistan came every week to refill the water jugs and organize books. This wasn't a service, it was a community, and William, he remained at the center of it, not as a savior, but as a steward, a quiet force. Word of the waiting room spread beyond Dayton like wildfire carried by dry wind. Veterans in neighboring cities began sharing pictures and stories of their own local versions. In Cleveland, a retired Marine converted his garage into a gathering spot. In Pittsburgh, a former nurse opened a small counseling center inspired by William's model. Suddenly, what started as one man's response was becoming a grassroots network of healing and solidarity. National media outlets began to take notice. They called it a compassion movement or a revolution of quiet care. But William himself was cautious about labels. "This isn't a movement," he insisted in interviews. "It's a correction." Some VA employees, current and former, volunteered. One nurse, who had quit years ago, showed up weekly to run health workshops. A clerk still on payroll came after hours to organize donations. They didn't want cameras or credit, just to help. The donations poured in from unexpected places. A single mother in Vermont sent hundreds of homemade scarves. A tech worker in Seattle donated laptops. An anonymous former senator wired $10,000 with a note. "For all the years I didn't vote better." Despite growing visibility, William refused to turn the waiting room into a formal institution. He believed bureaucracies often lose heart. He wanted it to remain a sanctuary, raw and real. Inside, the stories multiplied. A young woman reunited with her estranged father after seeing the viral video. A disabled veteran who had lost hope returned to school. A group of homeless vets finally found shelter through community efforts sparked by the space. Yet criticism wasn't absent. Some argued William's story was weaponizing suffering to shame the VA. Others claimed the government was doing its best under impossible circumstances. William never responded directly to detractors. Instead, he pointed to the wall inside the waiting room, where names of veterans were handwritten on paper strips. Each name a quiet testimony. Above them, a single line read, "If they won't write you into the story, write your own wall." Behind those words was a powerful truth. Some stories are invisible, not because they don't matter, but because they aren't told loud enough. As the waiting room grew, so did its community. Volunteers of all ages showed up, not just veterans, but civilians who'd been touched by William's simple act. They brought supplies, shared skills, and carried stories. One Saturday morning, William watched a young man teach a group how to build resumes. Across the room, a former nurse helped a woman manage her PTSD triggers. William smiled quietly to himself. He wasn't alone anymore. The man who had once sat, ignored outside a clinic, had built a bridge, a crossing where none existed. How often are the loudest cries the only ones heard? And what happens when the quiet ones find a voice? Exactly 1 year after the video first went viral, a quiet ceremony was held, not at the VA clinic, but at the waiting room, the small storefront that had become a beacon of hope and resilience. The building across the street, the official VA clinic, remained unchanged, cold, bureaucratic, and faceless. Its walls told no stories, and its doors still echoed with the silence of unattended pleas. But inside the waiting room, the atmosphere was completely different. The air was filled with laughter, tears, and the kind of community that only grows from shared pain and shared healing. William himself was not there to see it. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 nights before the ceremony. No public announcement, no grand farewell. Only the quiet dignity of a man who had lived his life with steadfast courage, patience, and an unshakable hope for change. The plaque that was unveiled and mounted on the brick wall outside bore a simple yet profound inscription: William J. Carter. He waited, then he built. Friends, volunteers, and veterans gathered in hushed tones, each sharing memories of a man who had taught them that waiting, when met with endurance, was not weakness, but a form of resistance. They spoke of how kindness, even the smallest acts of kindness, could ripple outward to shift the trajectory of many lives, how one man's refusal to be invisible became a call to action for thousands. Inside the room, the walls were adorned with photographs capturing moments of connection, smiles shared over cups of coffee, hands clasped in solidarity, letters handwritten in shaky ink, and colorful artwork created by children and veterans alike. A mural stretched along the adjacent alley wall, depicting the iconic scene that had started it all. William, kneeling in his worn military jacket and battered boots, offering a crumpled $5 bill to a rain-soaked teenager. The eyes in the mural held the weight of countless stories, of struggle, survival, and hope, and glowed with the quiet spark of humanity. William had quietly used the remaining donations to establish a foundation named the First $5. Its mission was clear and uncompromising: to fund grassroots veteran aid initiatives led by veterans themselves, bypassing red tape and bureaucratic delay. No executive offices, no endless paperwork, just trust, community, and direct action. From Dayton to Pittsburgh, Cleveland to Little Rock, the waiting room name now graced many storefronts and community centers, each bearing a copy of the mural and a shared commitment to keep William's legacy alive. Communities, once isolated and overlooked, now had a place to gather, share, and rebuild. Across the nation, people began to recreate that simple act of generosity, buying meals for strangers, offering rides to appointments, listening with open hearts without judgment or interruption. The ripple that began with a single $5 bill in a rain-soaked moment was now a wave sweeping through towns and cities. Years from now, many would forget the viral video that brought attention to William's story. They might forget the headlines and the fleeting social media storms. But somewhere, in a quiet town, a child would pause before a mural, staring at the outstretched hand of a man whose kindness was far more than charity. It was a symbol, a promise, a reminder that even when institutions fail, humanity endures, that waiting is not surrender, but preparation, and that one small act of kindness, extended without expectation, can build a future no bureaucracy ever could. could the quietest acts of kindness become the loudest echoes across generations? And if one man's $5 could change a nation, what might your small act do?